What kind of sailors deliberately crossed the coldest ocean on Earth and chose not to bring fire? Not because they couldn't, not because they didn't know how, but because they decided it was safer without it. That choice hides in plain sight, beneath everything we think we understand about the Vikings. Popular culture teaches us to picture them as howling warriors, wrapped in furs, charging headlong into nature with nothing but courage and rage. It is a seductive image, simple, violent, and wrong. When archaeology and environmental science enter the story, that myth begins to crack. The Vikings who crossed the North Atlantic were not driven by impulse. They were not gambling with their lives out of desperation or bravado. What emerges instead is something far more unsettling. A culture capable of restraint in situations where restraint meant survival. To grasp this, we have to let go of the idea that Viking voyages were reckless adventures powered by raw toughness. They were not men surviving by luck. They were men surviving by design. Every decision, what they wore, how they slept, what they carried, and what they deliberately left behind was shaped by an intimate understanding of risk. Fire, the oldest human comfort, was not viewed as protection. It was seen as a threat. And that realization alone changes how we see everything else. These sailors understood that warmth could be engineered without flame, that discipline could replace comfort, and that systems could outperform strength. This is where the Viking story becomes uncomfortable, because planners are harder to romanticize than berserkers. They force us to confront a truth we often overlook. The most dangerous journeys in history were not conquered by fearlessness, but by careful calculation. The Vikings did not charge blindly into the unknown. They measured it, they adapted to it, and in doing so, they reveal themselves not as reckless adventurers, but as some of the earliest maritime strategists the world has ever known. The North Atlantic is not merely cold. It is an environment that actively works against human survival. Even in the modern age, with satellite weather models, reinforced hulls, insulated cabins, and emergency beacons broadcasting distress signals across the globe, sailors still lose their lives here every year. The ocean does not care how advanced the technology is. Its waters hover just above freezing, cold enough to drain heat from the human body at terrifying speed. Without proper protection, immersion leads to muscle failure, confusion, and unconsciousness in minutes. Rescue, even when possible, often comes too late. Now strip all of that away. No engine to fight the waves. No cabin to seal out wind. No insulation beyond wood, wool, and skin. A Viking longship was not a refuge. It was an exposed, living surface, riding dangerously close to the waterline. The hull flexed with every swell. Wind did not flow around the ship, it cut through it, threading itself between bodies and planks. Each wave threw freezing spray across the deck, soaking clothing, stiffening rope, and flash-freezing fabric into armor made of ice. In these conditions, comfort was not an option. There was no safe corner to retreat into, no moment where the sea loosened its grip. Fatigue, inattention, or poor judgment did not cause discomfort. They caused death. This was an ocean that punished hesitation and magnified every error. And yet, against all logic, Viking crews chose to remove the one force humans had depended on for warmth since the first campfires were lit. That decision defies instinct. It challenges everything we assume about survival. So the question remains, why would anyone facing the most unforgiving ocean on Earth willingly abandon fire? The answer does not begin in legend or speculation. It begins in the ground. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered Viking ships preserved in burial mounds, peat bogs, and the oxygen-poor mud of fjords. These are not fragments or symbolic offerings. They are full-scale vessels, built to sail, tested by real voyages, and carefully laid to rest. Among them, the Gokstad and Oseberg ships stand as the most complete examples of Viking maritime technology ever recovered. These ships tell a story not only through what survived, but through what is missing. And what is missing is impossible to ignore. There are no hearthstones embedded in the deck, no layers of ash trapped between planks, no scorch marks on beams or ribs, no metal braziers rolled aside or repurposed. No vents, chimneys, or structural openings designed to carry smoke. Not one trace. Across different regions, different time periods, and different ship types, the pattern remains unchanged. This is not a coincidence, and it is not a gap in preservation. Fires leave signatures that survive centuries: charred wood, mineral ash, warped fastenings. Their complete absence speaks loudly. Fire was not something Vikings occasionally used at sea and later cleaned away. It was something they designed their ships to prevent. The hulls, layouts, and internal spaces were built with no accommodation for flame at all. This was not ignorance of fire's benefits. Vikings used fire extensively on land. They understood it deeply. What we see here is something far more deliberate. Fire was excluded by design, by rule, by policy. To understand the choice, you first have to understand the ship itself. Viking longships were not crude wooden boats. They were highly refined machines, engineered for speed, endurance, and survival in violent seas. Their hulls were built using the clinker method, overlapping planks of oak or pine, fastened with iron rivets, and sealed with layers of pine tar and animal fat. This construction allowed the ship to flex with the waves rather than resist them, absorbing energy instead of shattering under it. Their sails were no less deliberate. Woven from dense wool and saturated with oil or fat, they were designed to shed water, catch wind efficiently, and survive constant exposure to salt and spray. Every element of the vessel prioritized lightness and movement. The ship was meant to bend, to breathe, to behave almost like a living thing on the water. But that same brilliance carried a deadly consequence. Tar, oil, dried wood, wool, rope. Nearly every surface on a longship was flammable. Fire would not smolder here. It would race. A single spark, caught by an oily sail or a pitch-filled seam, could leap across the deck in seconds. There were no pumps to flood a fire, no sealed compartments to contain it, no tools capable of stopping it once it began. At sea, fire was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence. The Vikings understood this reality with brutal clarity. They did not romanticize flame as warmth or comfort. They recognized it as the single most uncontrollable threat their ships faced. Cold could be layered against. Wet could be managed. Wind could be endured. Fire offered no second chances. So they made a decision that feels alien to modern thinking. Cold could be controlled. Fire could not. They removed fire completely. And having done that, they redesigned everything else: clothing, sleep, diet, and discipline to survive without it. Without fire, warmth had to come from somewhere. The Vikings found it not in tools, but in biology. Their clothing systems were not crude layers thrown together in desperation. They were refined thermal designs, tested over generations of exposure to cold, wind, and salt. At the heart of these systems was wool not chosen by habit or tradition, but by performance. Wool fibers naturally trap pockets of air, creating insulation that remains effective even when soaked. Few materials on Earth behave this way, and fewer still were available to early medieval sailors. Garments were arranged with intention. Outer layers were coarse and tightly woven to shed water and blunt the wind. Beneath them, softer and finer wool sat close to the skin, holding warmth in place. Over critical areas, hides from reindeer, seal, or bear were added to block airflow where heat loss was greatest. Nothing was decorative. Everything had a function. Openings in the clothing were treated as vulnerabilities. Each morning, sleeves, collars, and hems were tightened with cord or waxed thread. Wrists, necks, and ankles were sealed deliberately, reducing convective heat loss in the same way modern cold-weather suits use gaskets and cuffs. Warmth was not assumed. It was maintained. Even footwear followed this logic. Boots were packed with dried grass, not for softness, but for moisture management. Sweat was dangerous in cold environments. Wet feet froze faster than dry ones. Grass absorbed moisture and could be removed and replaced as conditions changed. In this system, survival was personal. Each sailor was responsible for regulating his own heat, monitoring his body, and adjusting layers before failure set in. There was no external warmth to rely on. Discipline became insulation. Awareness became heat. Cold kills fastest when the body stops moving. The Vikings knew this. Not as theory, but as lived experience. Night was the most dangerous part of the voyage. Muscles stiffened. Wet clothing drew heat away from the skin. Exhaustion dulled awareness. Alone, a man could fade into hypothermia without realizing it was happening. So isolation was treated as a threat and removed entirely. Sleep aboard a longship was not private. It was communal by design. Sailors paired together, sharing bedding constructed from layered wool and tightly stitched animal skins. These were not loose blankets thrown over tired bodies. They were sealed systems, built to trap warmth, block wind, and limit heat loss to the surrounding air. Once inside, movement slowed, breathing steadied, and heat accumulated. The effect was dramatic. Combined body heat could raise internal temperatures by 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, often the narrow margin between survival and death. Warmth was no longer something an individual generated alone. It became something shared, maintained through proximity and trust. The environment around them was shaped to support this system. Sleeping areas were raised above bilge water, isolating bodies from the coldest surface of the ship. Sails were lowered and angled to form windbreaks, reducing exposure to gusts that stripped heat away. Planks, ribs, and even the curve of the hull were used to create pockets of relative calm within the chaos of the sea. Nothing was accidental. Every decision reflected an understanding of how heat moved, how bodies failed, and how small advantages compounded over time. In those hours before dawn, the ship ceased to be a mere vessel. It became a living thermal organism, one sustained not by fire, but by human connection. No fire meant no cooking, and without cooking, the Vikings were forced to rethink food itself. What they carried aboard their ships was not chosen for comfort or taste. It was selected for survival under the strictest constraints. Their provisions had to deliver maximum energy, resist spoilage for weeks or months, and remain edible in freezing wind without a single spark of flame. In doing so, they created one of the earliest examples of purpose-built expedition rations. Dried fish formed the backbone of these supplies. Cod and herring were split, cured, and air-dried until nearly weightless, yet dense with protein and fat. Hard bread, baked repeatedly until it approached the hardness of stone, could survive damp air and rough handling without molding. It was meant to be chewed slowly, softened with saliva, and consumed for endurance rather than pleasure. To this, they added fat-based pastes, mixtures of rendered animal fat blended with grains and berries. These compact foods delivered enormous caloric value in small volumes, functioning much like modern energy bars. In cold conditions, fat was not indulgence. It was fuel. Liquids were treated with the same logic. Fresh water alone was unreliable. It froze easily and spoiled quickly. Instead, crews carried fermented drinks such as sour ale, mead, or diluted whey. Fermentation lowered freezing points, preserved the liquid, and made it safer to consume over long voyages. Every item aboard was designed to be eaten cold. Nothing required preparation. Nothing risked ignition. Fire was not forgotten. It was relocated. Cooking fires burned on shore, at known camps and waypoints. At sea, restraint ruled. The ship remained cold by design, while the human body was fed exactly what it needed to endure it. This is the moment where the story turns. From raw survival into deliberate strategy. Viking voyages were never blind leaps into the unknown. They were calculated movements through a living system of coastlines, islands, and memory. A chain of known harbors. Seasonal camps. Reliable landing points etched into experience rather than maps. The ships themselves traveled cold. No open flame. No reckless warmth at sea. But the crews did not. They ate hot on shore. They rested beside fires built on land. Fire was not abandoned, it was relocated. This simple shift changed everything. By moving heat, cooking, and recovery off the ship and onto land, the Vikings broke the ocean into manageable segments. Each voyage became a series of short, survivable stages rather than a single fatal gamble. The North Atlantic was not crossed in one breath. It was inhaled slowly, island by island, season by season. This network of waypoints turned exploration into logistics, risk into routine, distance into memory. The Vikings did not conquer the ocean through force. They understood it. They learned its rhythms, and step by step, they mapped it. Seen through this lens, the Viking expansion becomes something else entirely. Not chaos, not madness, but systems thinking, centuries ahead of its time. The Vikings did not charge blindly into danger. They identified the single greatest risk: first cold, exposure, failure at sea, and removed it from the ship itself. Then they rebuilt everything around that decision. Clothing became a layered thermal system. Sleep became shared, controlled, and intentional. Food became dense, pre-prepared, and reliable. Ships became transport platforms, not floating homes. Logistics became the backbone of exploration. This was not bravery alone. It was risk management. This was not instinct. It was engineering. This was not myth. It was design thinking long before the term existed. Their ships did not dominate nature. They were tuned to it: flexible hulls, cold-ready sails, disciplined routines that treated wind, waves, and weather as variables rather than enemies. Nature was not conquered. It was integrated. That is why they reached Greenland, why they crossed into Newfoundland, why they stood in Constantinople. Not because they were fearless, but because they were precise. So we return to the question: why did the Vikings cross the most dangerous ocean on Earth without fire? Because fire was the enemy. On a wooden ship soaked in salt, pitch, and wind, flame was not warmth. It was catastrophe waiting for oxygen. Cold, by contrast, was honest. It sharpened discipline. It enforced cooperation. It punished mistakes early, before they became fatal. In the frozen silence of the North Atlantic, the Vikings discovered something older than technology and stronger than comfort. Human systems, human intelligence, human restraint. They learned that survival did not come from conquering the environment, but from designing themselves to live inside it. They did not warm the ship. They warmed their bodies through clothing, movement, shared sleep, and controlled routine. Heat became internal. Risk became external and manageable. And through that restraint, through that refusal to rely on flame, they transformed the coldest sea on Earth into something else entirely. Not a barrier, a road. This is Shadows of Valhalla, where survival was engineered, not imagined, and where the past still teaches those willing to listen. Today, we flip a switch and expect warmth instantly. We insulate ourselves from discomfort and call it progress. But long before heaters and engines, there were people who chose exposure over safety, not out of recklessness, but understanding. At Shadows of Valhalla, we explore these forgotten choices. Not to romanticize the past, but to understand what humans are capable of when comfort is removed and intelligence is all that remains. If this story stayed with you, consider what it means. And when you imagine a Viking again, don't see a brute battling the storm. See an engineer who learned to become part of it.